Just to say that if you are enjoying this podcast and you'd like to give us a bit of extra support, you can head over to our Support Us page where you can give us a tip, or you can follow us on Patreon and you can download our newsletter. And we really appreciate everybody who gives us a bit of extra support there.
Palantir is a very interesting example because it's being heavily criticized, as we all know. I think what this example also illustrates is how this technology can move from military context to law enforcement and criminal justice context. The way it started to enter Ukraine was primarily for military purposes, and then it transitioned also to other uses.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph. So do you spend any time reading those really glossy annual reports that come out from the International Criminal Court? You know, the ones from the Office of the Prosecutor, and they get launched at the Assembly of States parties every year?
Boy, do I ever. I do read them, and I try to parse them for every little bit of information that I can possibly glean. And it's not very much.
Yeah, well, good luck with that. Yeah, they're so glossy that they just gloss over everything, in my view. But do you remember that there was, I think it was about 2 years ago, there was this line in one of them that said that the Office of the Prosecutor was going to become a leader in technology, and they were making a big investment in a particular tech called Project Harmony, as far as I remember. And this was a way they were going to improve the management of evidence. Did that?
Absolutely. I actually did a deep dive into it because I wanted to do a story about how they were going to use AI in parsing through evidence. But what I remember from it was that it was very general and that they didn't want to tell me very much more in detail about what they were doing. And so I couldn't, in a way, sell it to my editors to do a story about it. So I tried and failed.
Yeah. Okay, well, here's a chance for redemption. How little we know, we will put on show. But yeah, welcome to our lives as journalists, asking questions and getting only minimal answers. So that in itself has been at the back of my mind for a little while. And then when somebody about 6 months or so ago mentioned a thing called relativity to me. That's a system that's apparently being used by some organizations. It belongs to Microsoft, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And that's all about how AI, artificial intelligence, is being used in connection with legal data. So that started me really thinking about what are the systems that everybody is using? What are the ways that AI is being used? What do we need to know about? And how is machine learning coming about?
Yeah, one of the things I'm really interested in is how do you tag these databases? How much does this cost? How effective is it? They made a big deal of kind of overhauling and modernizing the OTP evidence presentation also during trials. But of course, we also know that now there are issues with Microsoft and the ICC, and they're moving away from it. So what are they going to do with these systems is another kind of more current point that I'm sure we will get to.
Yeah, we're actually recording this podcast as the second part of our tiny little toe in the water series about artificial intelligence and international criminal justice.
Yeah, I really enjoyed our previous episode where we talked with Jessica Dorsey and Elke Schwartz about AI targeting.
So this time we're going to talk specifically about investigations and AI.
To help us out, we have a friend of the pod and former podcast producer herself, Marta Bow of the Asser Institute. Hi, Martha.
Hi, Janet. Hi, Steph. Thank you for having me.
And we have a new person on the podcast, but very journalist friendly, Benjamin Thorne, who's from Reading. Hi, Benjamin.
Hi, both of you, and thank you for the very kind invitation to participate in this conversation.
The way to kick this off probably is to start the same way we did our previous podcast, to ask you, Martha, to define what do we mean? What is AI in this context?
That's a great starting point, Steph, because AI is very much an umbrella term. If we don't unpack it, we risk talking past each other. So on the one hand, we have rule-based systems. They operate on a base of if-then logic. So if we imagine an AI system that is programmed, for example, to identify words like attack or orders or weapons in document, and then based on this identification, it would flag a certain document as relevant for a war crime investigator. So this is very different from machine learning systems. A machine learning system in this context would be instead trained on the basis of documents that are labeled as relevant for war crimes investigators or not relevant for war crimes investigators. So it would learn from patterns on this document. So instead of identifying keywords, it would learn also that, for example, ordering to carry out an operation and not only an attack would basically be the same thing. So it would identify such document as relevant. And machine learning systems are very good at pattern recognitions, and they're much more efficient than rule-based systems. At the same time, they're more opaque, and I'm sure this is something that it will come up more as a problem of these systems in this podcast. Now, on top of machine learning systems, we also have LLMs, large language models. So the technology that is behind ChatGPT, for example. And these models, they analyze language and they provide analysis and of legal language, for example. Based on LLMs, we also have an increasing role of agentic AI, so AI assistants that can help in a variety of tasks. So they do not only react to prompt, they can actually perform plan steps. And this could potentially be very useful for investigations as well.
Okay, so there's a lot of different details in there. What's the most important thing for us to understand as to how this relates to international criminal justice investigations?
Yeah, I think what is important is to what task in criminal proceedings these or different types of AI that can often be combined are applied to. So international criminal proceedings, as you know, are very complex proceedings that involve hundreds of victims, witnesses, hundreds of pages of witness testimonies, video footages, intercepted communications. And investigators do not need to only prove that a single murder has been committed by an individual soldier. On top of the underlying crimes, they have to prove contextual element, as you know, so that crimes were part of widespread or systematic attacks, or that they were carried out in the context of an armed conflict. So this is very much a linking exercises. You need to link several crimes, victims of crimes in different geographic parts of certain countries. So you have to connect the patterns of crimes and you have to connect individual perpetrators also to high-level perpetrators. In this linking exercise, AI can be potentially very useful. So AI is very good at pattern recognitions in these linking exercises and in processing, analyzing, categorizing huge amount of evidence. These are not just hypothetical applications, but this is how AI is being used right now. So in Ukraine, the Office of Prosecutor General has been used platform provided by Palantir to integrate different sources of evidence, satellite imagery, documents. So this is what these platforms are very good at, integrating data. And in the context of international criminal prosecution, this can be very helpful, for example, to mapping command structures or to map patterns of crimes.
So Martha mentioned some of the investigators of some of the offices who are working on things with these models and with this AI assisted kind of searching through the evidence. Benjamin, Are there any other investigators worth mentioning who would you like to lift out?
Sure. So I think obviously the ICC, like many things to do with international criminal justice, takes up a lot of space and perhaps oxygen, and perhaps rightfully or wrongfully so. But I think in these conversations, when you're asking about sort of different types of investigators, we are talking about core international crimes and international criminal justice. But I think this is also overlap to kind of the connected field of transitional justice as well, because there are a number of organizations who are using different types of AI. And some of that might be in terms of criminal prosecutions, but some of it might be also to document human rights violations that also might relate to core crimes, such as crimes against humanity. Can I refer to this in some of my current work as the sort of digital accountability ecosystem? And I think when we're talking about investigators, they are a number of different actors with sometimes shared purposes, perhaps also sometimes competing agendas as well. So I think when we're talking about this ecosystem of investigators and those who are interested in AI technologies and digital evidence, I think it's not necessarily a homogenous whole, but I think it's perhaps more useful to think about it as there's these different component parts, one being investigators within the OTP, but they're not all moving in the same direction. And this ecosystem is more fragmented, perhaps certainly diverse, and at times contested. So in terms of more narrow criminal investigators, we have people like it was just mentioned at the ICC, but also Eurojust, also UN relevant units such as the IIMM and the IIIM, and up until 2024 UNITAD as well, which is where Karim Khan came from before he took up his post as chief prosecutor at the ICC. But we also have domestic war crimes units in different European countries who to varying degrees may be using some sort of AI tools. But then we also have, as we'll well know, ONSINT organizations and broadly related human rights organizations that have their own investigative teams. Definitely some overlaps. Just to give some examples, ONSINT for Ukraine, Bellingcat's Justice and Accountability Unit, although that closed, I think it was late 24 or 25. There's Witness. Air Wars is an interesting one, particularly in this context, as they gather a lot of geolocation data, for want of a better word, but they don't gather it for a specific purpose in terms of a trial. My understanding is they gather it more to gather it, and then it could be used for a variety of processes. But they quite publicly talk about how they've made a choice not to use AI. And I was at a talk where someone from Air Wars was, I think it was last autumn, and they were saying that because these potential violations are very much a human process, the process of analyzing that data should also be a human process, partly linking that to dignity. So I think it's quite interesting how there's a lot of AI going on in this kind of investigation processes by a variety of institutions and organizations. However, there are a few, and I think Air Wars is one of those that's kind of resisting in some sense the use of AI. We also have organizations like Eyewitness to Atrocity, who refer to themselves as a closed source investigation organization. Another one that I've become aware of relatively recently called Earshot. So we often think of digital investigations and the use of AI around the visual, kind of what we see, whether it's through geolocation data or a social media post, and around kind of visual verification of that. But also audio is a really big part of that. So it's an organization called Earshot that does ballistics, for example. So I think that's kind of interesting component of that, and they use AI within some of their work. I think another part of this that's just kind of often sits at the margin is, in quotations, consultants. So particularly human rights organizations who are involved with a lot of this work directly, they will sometimes, for want of a better word, outsource some of the analysis to external consultants. So whether we think of those consultants perhaps or perhaps not as part of who we consider investigators. Then we have organizations such as what I refer to in some of my writing as activist archives. You may well know the group Mnemonic, who kind of is an umbrella for archives such as the Syrian Archive, Yemen Archive, etc. And interestingly, we think of ONSINT organizations as kind of this big thing that's happening in terms of documenting and contributing to evidence for possible trials. But organizations such as the Syrian Archive kind of predates a lot of the work that a lot of the ONSINT groups are doing. But groups such as the Syrian Archive are kind of, and have been for more than a decade, documenting and now using AI within that documentation process to prepare that material for a justice yet to come. And I don't know if we can even include perhaps journalists as investigators. So I think you might agree or disagree with some of that, but I think it is useful to try and nuance what we mean by investigators and also the kind of work that they're doing.
I think for this podcast, we're probably going to focus mainly on the kind of courts that we follow in direct investigation of war crimes, just because we need to narrow it down. I wanted to ask Marta specifically, because you referred to that the Ukraine Office of the Prosecutor General was using AI, and specifically Palantir, for some of their war crimes investigations, which is remarkable to me because Palantir, we talked about it also in our other podcast about AI targeting. It's been criticized for its kind of deep involvement in the military. So I wonder if there are concerns around some organizations more than others with AI and what you should use as a kind of diligent war crimes investigator, if we're talking about that group of people.
I think Palantir is a very interesting example because it has been involved in defense context, law enforcement context, and being heavily criticized, as we all know, for its involvement in many of ICE operations. I think what this example also illustrates is how this technology can move from military context to law enforcement and criminal justice context. Because the way it started to enter Ukraine was primarily for military purposes, so for military targeting. And then it transitioned also to other uses. But this, of course, in terms of legal safeguards, present some issues because the guardrails in terms of human rights, etc., that you would have in a law enforcement context would be different compared to like a defense context. But if I can go back a bit to what also Benjamin highlighted, which I thought it was extremely interesting, is that because of its inherent characteristics, international crimes involved so many institutions, because they involved so many communities, because of their gravity, impact. So ideally, it would be desirable to have more coordinations also in terms of how AI is implemented within this context, because you would have then standardized procedures for admissibility, reliability checks, etc., etc. Instead, the tendency is very much the opposite. Every organization, every national authority are developing bespoke AI systems that work within their environment. This is also to protect confidentiality, of course, because in criminal law context, this is a paramount concern. So we have this tendency to develop AI assistants working only in Italy, for example, and within the Italian judiciary. And of course, when evidence is processed through one institution's AI pipeline, they're categorized, translated, summarized, they may arrive in another institution with in a format that is incompatible or partially processed, or maybe metadata is stripped. So this just creates an enormous amount of compatibility problems and admissibility problems in proceedings for which, by definition, institutions should be cooperating, exchange evidence as much as possible.
Steph picked up Palantir. I wanted to pick up the thing that I mentioned at the top of the pod, which was this thing called relativity, because I'm wondering whether that's becoming some kind of standard, understanding that it's been developed very specifically for judicial purposes. And the context in which it was spoken about to me was me asking, where is all the UNITAD evidence? all the stuff out of Iraq that was gathered, which, some of it is going for various trials across Europe. And somebody said to me, oh, don't worry, it's in New York. It's been entered into relativity. The problem is that there's no person to push the buttons in order to extract it from relativity and to send it around in its different formats to the different spaces that it's needed. You need a budget to be able to run the relativity, but the evidence exists there. So I was wondering, Benjamin, since Marta did Palantir, do you want to do relativity for us and any other systems that you think we need to know about?
So there's relativity, there's also Accenture as well. So if you think about Project Harmony, is this kind of pyramid, if you like, main organizations that partnered with ICC. So we also have Microsoft, we have Accenture, and then Avanade. Avanade is kind of consumed within both of those. It was partly funded, as I understand it, by Accenture. But then within those kind of three partners of Project Harmony, you do, as you rightly say, a big part of that is relativity. Maybe it's just helpful very briefly to say that Project Harmony has three components. It has the OTP link, which is this kind of portal, comes under kind of Article 15 communications, where in principle, any stakeholders or anyone can upload information. That's increasingly being kind of potential evidence, if you want to call it that. So that's why I think we were talking about investigations a few moments ago, why organizations like OWNS and human rights are quite important, because they are doing that. So they are uploading information to OTP link. In terms of relativity, they kind of, as I understand it, and again, as Janet alluded to at the very top of the podcast, it's difficult to understand what's happening because it's very secretive, is my experience. In addition to OTP link, there's two parts. There's the eVault, which is more of the Microsoft part, the storage that people started panicking about a lot when there was the sanctions and kind of access. And it was reported that within the OTP office, they were apparently, some people were printing off dossiers because of fear they might not be able to access that. So that's the Microsoft part.
The sanctions that you're referring to, Benjamin, are the US sanctions against certain individuals at the ICC, with Stephanie's amazing reporting out of Reuters to suggest that there is actually a sort of Damocles held over the whole institution, and who knows. So I assume that's what you're referring to.
Exactly that, and what I think is increasingly becoming perhaps maybe kind of a web of sanctions that people are fearful to trip. And so this idea of kind of over-compliance. Yes, interestingly, that's kind of died down a little bit, those conversations. It's not saying they're not going to come back, but it has kind of settled down a little bit, maybe since the very end of last year, in terms of, actual sanctions coming out of the US administration. But that certainly is a big issue. And then you have e-discovery, which is where some of the AI tools in terms of the analysis, and that's, as I understand it, where relativity comes in. Relativity, as kind of was alluded to by Marta, some of this stuff comes from a domestic criminal justice setting. So this, for example, relativity tools is used within the criminal justice system in the UK, for example, relating to police body cameras, also in court video technology as well. So I think, again, go back to one of your comments earlier, Janet, when you were saying there's this big claim of the ICC will become a global leader in accountability technologies, which was part of its strategic goals of 23-25. That's just the usual ICC chest beating, for want of a better word, perhaps. But I think it does also have real-world implications, a bit like sometimes it might overclaim to do things around victim participation. I think, yes, you can just say, well, it's just the ICC being the ICC, but it does make these big claims and people do interpret that. And maybe that is kind of, again, over-promising to back to old issues with the ICC. But going back to relativity, they are these connections between the domestic criminal justice system that are being kind of used. So it's not to say that ICC in the future won't perhaps develop its own technologies or adapt those, but at the moment, a lot of what's happening, from my understanding, it's kind of been taken from the domestic criminal justice and being adapted or adopted in a variety of ways, perhaps slightly more bespoke ways going forward. And in terms of Marta mentioning kind of military connections, my understanding of Accenture is a beast of a technology company. If you have a look at all its different, has metaphorically lots of fingers and lots of pies, and they have a lot of contracts to do with the US military. I think my understanding is also NATO. So they're involved in this. Is also kind of sees that connection between military application and kind of to justice application as well. A few conversations I've had around relativity with people inside the OTP. And again, these are informal conversations rather than formal research interviews, but it is that the systems they use are a bit more fragmented. So if we're thinking around storage, analysis and disclosure, they are a few different systems and they're not all compatible with things such as relativity.
Now, I still have, although I understand what you're saying, my very basic question is what does relativity do? What kind of program is it? And should I envision it as a kind of, is it supposed to be like an operating system or like this kind of one-stop shop, what Microsoft does with Office? Is it the idea with relativity that they offer some kind of suite of programs that you as a legal officer or an investigator could use? And it includes, I don't know, a word processor or a filing system and all these things? Or is it AI specifically? Because I still don't know what relativity does. I understand the court management system. If you have a court case, I know there's all those e-court things, and this is, you share documents and all those. But what is the product that relativity is in a very basic sense?
It is a kind of e-discovery. So I think that has a variety of tools. How it's used at the ICC, again, I'm not certain from my conversations. It's used to do with things such as facial recognition, object recognition. So if it sees a particular object in an image, then it can compare that to a similar object in a different image as well. As I understand it, it also has some text-based analysis. So again, with transcripts, for example, it can then map certain words as well. So those, as I understand in the ICC, that's what it is. But yeah, to do with visual facial recognition, identifying words within text and transcript as well. So the ICC use this, for want of a better word, cute language of evidence management platform. But even I think in that process, before we get to kind of what we might think of the conventional analysis, such as facial recognition, there is also, my understanding is, there is AI involved in kind of the sorting and cataloging. And then that might potentially create issue or have issues relating to bias, or also just things if a document's being kind of titled with an odd title by whoever did it externally, is there issues there as well? So I think AI, yes, in the analysis, using tools provided by relativity, but also the platform that also has AI. And I think we need to think about that as part of the kind of the AI terrain as well.
Marta, quite a lot of what we're discussing sounds to me very mundane, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I think we need to put something on the front page of our podcast to say we use AI, for example, for transcription. Sometimes even when I'm transcribing something in Ukrainian, it does an automatic translation for me, which I don't necessarily think the translation's perfect, but, thank you. That's good, isn't it? So at least I know I've got the basics of what somebody has to say. So I kind of think of this as like, that's normal. And it's just like an assistance tool in that sense. But I understand that, like the last podcast that we did on AI, we specifically discussed the ethical issues. So are there a lot of ethical perils, let's say? I understood that one of the judges at a meeting that you were at described them as ethical perils. Yulia Motok used that term. So what do you think? What are the problems with this?
So I think there are both ethical and legal problems because what we have been discussing so far, for example, are still uses of AI that requires some sort of human verifications, right? So we're thinking about facial recognition systems that helps skimming through thousands of photos and basically at the end of this process, you would in principle have also someone verifying the whole process. So for me, the first problem in relation to the idea of human verifications, that we would still use AI with human verification, is basically that often to maintain this human judgment and this human capability to understand what these systems are producing and are recommending to us, it's quite difficult. because there are proven studies that prove that there are cognitive bias when we use these systems that might lead to over-reliance on AI output. Now, this means that the errors that AI itself can produce, such as, for example, missing key information, missing exonerating evidence, exonerating information that the prosecutor has the duty to investigate, might be missed. So there are inherent errors in what AI can do and can produce. And if we couple this issue with the cognitive problems and the automation bias issues, this might lead to critical errors in investigations, in decision making. So on the one hand, AI can help process massive amount of evidence and large volume of data. But my core argument is that these tools also introduce serious risk in terms of misidentifications, misinterpretation of data, failures to detect crucial evidence, including exonerating evidence. So under Article 54 of the Rome Statute, the prosecutor has the duty to establish the truth and to investigate both incriminating and exonerating evidence equally. So if an AI system leads investigators to overlook evidence or materials that might be exonerating, this obligation might be not fully met. Now, this is not a fully fledged violation of disclosures, but could still have serious consequence for the investigations. Now, if we think about this and if we consider the transparency problem around what type of AI is being used, for which task, for which purposes, for which uses, basically AI has been implemented. And if we consider that AI is often difficult to understand, unexplainable, it might be extremely difficult for the defense to understand and detect, for example, if something has gone wrong, if something has gone missing, and if there was a violation of the duty to investigate exonerating evidence. So the main takeaway for me is that we should not be rejecting the use of AI, but its use needs transparency around what has been used, and only after that we can start thinking about safeguards, guardrails, disclosure protocols, etc., in order to safeguard the rights of the defense.
My question is, can we ever expect transparency from AI systems as a kind of general rule? Because they are commercial systems that kind of secret sauce is hidden and not public. It's run by commercial companies. It's not an open source situation. So, Benjamin, take it away.
I think these are still human decisions whether there is transparency or not, whether it's in the source or in the tools and how those tools are being used. It's still always these are just systems and algorithms if we're going to boil it down to their essence. So I think it's always a human decision, choices made or not made when it comes to transparency and other ethical related issues. And I think a lot of this conversation around transparency comes to legitimacy as well. And if we don't have transparency, it really potentially impacts on legitimacy. Legitimacy in two interconnected ways is the main way I see it. Legitimacy of the process of how AI is used, but then also legitimacy of the outputs that process produces. So if we don't have transparency of what exactly those tools are, how they're being used, and also the algorithms were embedded within those tools and systems, I think it really raises legitimacy concerns. And so I think, yes, we can say, oh, these are not open source systems, but I do think to some extent there is a responsibility of institutions such as the ICC, sadly they're not the only ones, but I think there is a responsibility for them to engage more with transparency. So these are kind of ethical related questions as I see them. And transparency is one of those ethical related questions. And I think they do have a responsibility. I don't think it's good enough just to say, oh, we can't discuss some of this because it could affect investigations. Maybe there are instances where they can't talk exactly about what they're using or the algorithms behind it. There are times where I think they should be talking about that. And I think they hide behind the kind of this secrecy. I would just add to that, they are not the only organization that's quite secretive around how they use AI tools. And I think this goes back to something I said near the beginning of the podcast, is there is some kind of competition between different institutional organizations who are in some ways directly involved with documenting human rights violations that relate to core international crimes. So that secrecy and lack of transparency goes beyond the ICC. In terms of conversations I've had with a couple of defense counsels working in the ICC, one of their concerns is they don't know how the OTP is using AI. So again, it goes back to transparency. So that is a concern for them, that they feel very much out of the loop as well. And that does raise questions to do with procedure and human rights. Also, that things we talked about, that content itself that is AI generated or modified, and then how does institutions such as the ICC own AI tools, recognize AI generated content? So again, this relates partly back to something like the OTP link platform, where external organizations or stakeholders can submit potential evidence, some of which may be AI modified or generated. Then how accurate can the tools that the OTP is using identify that? I mean, that's one issue. Also saying that Marta very accurately talked about how we have this kind of these different organizations, institutions, this ecosystem, as I put it. And she was talking about how the technologies they use, they're not always compatible with other organizations and institutions. So I mean, that is a big concern. I think another related concern to that, where evidence moves between different organizations and institutions, is what I refer to as kind of the layers of AI in terms of transparency. Let's say Eurojust, who have using their relatively new system, analyzed some potential evidence and have used some AI tools within that, and then it gets submitted to the OTP, for example. There is not an audit of any kind showing the different types of AI that we use, say, at Eurojust and at the ICC. So I think we have these layerings or layers of AI, but very little transparency about that in the specific context of how evidence moves between the cross different related criminal justice, international criminal justice institutions and organizations. And I think a part of that, like a big ongoing issue, is this lack of a more joint up approach. There's also, just in a very practical sense, duplication of efforts and resources as well, that we might have two or more organizations or institutions doing the same sort of analysis, which I think is problematic as well, particularly in terms of the resources and efforts that these things take to do anyway. I just want to pick up something that Marta said around human verification, which I completely agree with. Just to add to that a little, I think there's one conversation around there always has to be human verification. We hear this language of human in the loop. There has to be space for verification, human intervention, etc. But my understanding is that at some of these institutions, keeping with the ICC as an example, is sometimes a first layer of initial analysis that gets done with AI tools. Then the human investigator then looks at that, but the human investigator isn't necessarily looking at all of that digital information. They might look at all of the digital information that AI has kind of identified as potentially relevant, but there's sometimes a first layer that a human hasn't looked at all the potential evidence. And so I think when we're talking about verification, I think for me, AI tools are useful when a human is involved throughout the whole process. And yes, this means it's a long process, but then I think there are risks relating to kind of biases that come within the AI tools, but also biases that potentially become embedded within the patterns of the AI analysis itself. When investigators are looking at digital evidence using AI tools, but they need to see all the evidence, which some might say is an unrealistic call, but I think otherwise we're having an initial layer of analysis where the human might not see a piece of potential evidence. For example, a piece of evidence that AI has disregarded because it doesn't meet the algorithm or patterns it it has, but that might be useful, whether for the prosecutor or perhaps for disclosure reason. And I think in terms of transparency, I've asked and I had a few conversations around, are there any intentions to have a sort of OTP policy on the use of AI and the kind of the ethical use of AI within its work, which I think is much needed. And my understanding is that there is not. And I think that continues to be, for me, deeply problematic. There's not a willingness to have a policy on the ethical use of AI. If the OTP is going to continue to use AI, perhaps increasingly so, I think that is something that should be addressed. All of this, I think, is to do with transparency, lack of transparency, and to also not assume that AI always needs to be used in these processes. I think sometimes they have a very useful role to play, but I think also it's important for investigators to always be asking, why use AI for this particular task?
We talked about a lot already, and we have touched on a lot of different aspects, but the kind of journalist in me is always looking for the more newsy bits. So I'm really...
Shame on you.
Yeah.
Shame on you, Steph.
And I've been hammering away
this
at
is
these...
fascinating material, and I'm listening to it with great interest, but you go ahead and be journalist. Go on.
I want to ask, though, very specifically about these sanctions, because we're talking very specifically about this. Much of this AI, if not all, is US-based. There is some China-based, but that has its own problems. With these ICC sanctions, how realistic is it that the ICC and other kind of European justice institutions can keep using this relativity software or these Microsoft-based systems and store potential evidence on US servers of commercial companies that are in part beholden to what the US government orders them to do?
And I'd say it's not only relevant to the ICC, it's also relevant to all of the other actors that Benjamin has run through, because they're all having to think about whether they use US-based stuff. So who wants to take this as a last question?
I think some of this is that there is like an appetite, it appears, in Europe to try and move away from some of this. I think it does seem perhaps that, and again, perhaps talking within, but also slightly outside of the criminal justice context, but I think these things relate in terms of how we might be seeing organizations like the ICC moving away from these things. But there is an appetite to take more risks. I think some of the systems, and I guess here I'm talking a bit more about cloud systems rather than the tools, but those things are sometimes interconnected anyway. Some organizations and also domestic and regional governments are looking to take risk with untested at scale products because of what's happening. I think also, as Janet just alluded to, they are a number of organizations that have to consider this, but I think sometimes, particularly some owners and organizations who are working specifically on gathering evidence for criminal trials relating to atrocity crime, they're well aware of the issues with engaging with US and perhaps Chinese tech. However, their priority is to gather and analyze this information. That is their primary objective. And sometimes this comes down to really practical things like resources. And maybe they haven't got the resources to look and invest at this moment in alternatives, which I think, I mean, it's ideal to say everyone should be moving away from US and Chinese tech, perhaps. But I think if you're a small scale organization, it's a very different kind of calculation compared to the ICC. Just on the ICC and relativity, a lot of Project Harmony, or a big part of it, was funded by European Commission. I think it's around 7 million euros, and also some voluntary donation by state parties. So there is a question there: if the ICC is going to move away from relativity, how they're going to pay for it. I mean, maybe they'll find a magic money tree or something similar, as they sometimes do. But that is a consideration, I think. So even for big organizations like the ICC, is how they would fund the move away. From my understanding, the contract with relativity ran from 22 and it's due to expire 27. I'm not sure if that's been renewed. And again, maybe one of you knows more about that. And also my understanding is that the money that came from the European Commission and voluntary donations from states was not enough for Project Harmony. So they had to kind of dip into the kind of the regular budget a bit for that as well. I think they are both at the small scale, there's different kind of considerations whether to move away from US tech, but also for the ICC, they're also, I think, perhaps slightly different, but also financial considerations. But we don't know. I mean, I think is the bottom line here, when it comes to ICC at least, because it is so closed. We talk about transparency in terms of the tools, but just transparency of the ICC, I think, is maybe something we would maybe all to some extent agree upon, the lack of transparency. And that, I think, becomes a big issue when we are talking to things around tools which have direct impact on the admissibility of evidence that could affect a prosecution.
Marta, why don't you take us a bit inside the black box of the ICC or wherever and tell us more about what we need to know?
I think a bit at the more higher level, what is important to think when institutions start incorporating these technologies is that they don't really buy a product, a thing, but they buy a service. And this creates long-term dependencies, okay? In terms of also, if we think about the updates, reconfigurations that are necessary, and the expertise that must be continuously supplied by AI suppliers to the end consumer. So over time, this really creates a structural reliance on private companies. So this is also, like blending what a criminal justice system is and who has control over core tasks of criminal justice and investigations. So, of course, one solution could be European technological autonomy. And I think we are hearing this a lot in the defense context. Europe has the to rearm to develop AI is now at the core of rearmament efforts within Europe. And you could make the same argument for the judiciary, but this would require enormous amount of expertise, a massive amount of investment. So I think to think a bit more on the shorter term, what is needed is internal knowledge, internal capacity within institutions such as the ICC, to have internal expertise, in-house expertise, to understand the limitation of this system and to understand at least the basic elements of how they work. Okay, explainability is a core problem of these systems, but a basic understanding of what are the inputs, so what are the data that has been fed into the systems, how output are produced so that users have a meaningful understanding of it. I think it's necessary also to kind of decrease the reliance on industry, especially since we are going more and more towards co-development of these systems, and which then requires a relationship of trust with industry and training of the end users, which means ICC staff and investigators on how these tools should be used.
We're definitely going to have to bring you both back in because we had another series of questions that we're not going to get to. But we're just going to ask our final question. We're not going to ask all of them. The last one is there anything that you have been reading or listening to or watching in the last wee while, either within the field or something completely different to get away from it, that you would like to share with the audience that you think it would be interesting for them to know about? Marta, why don't you kick us off?
So my final point, since we've been discussing many applications and very limitedly AI assistants, for me, is just a final comment on how cautious we should be, investigators should be, about the use of chatbots and AI systems, because all the risks that we have been discussing so far, especially around over-reliance, are more and more present with this agentic AI new trend, and judiciaries around Europe have started using chatbots and AI assistants for quite a trivial task, like a draft part of the judgment, but there should be much more awareness and training around the use of these systems. I think my final point is about a risk that is often not discussed enough, but it's de-skilling essentially. And it is highly concerning. To me, there are already many studies around how the use of AI assistants basically de-skill us, and slowly we lose our brain capacity and brain capability to solve even extremely easy tasks. So I think the problem of de-skilling should be put there. Yeah, there is a wired article from today, actually. Yes, that is very much about how actually it would be much better if AI assistant would tell us how to do things instead of giving us fully cooked replies, because these are effects on cognitive functions. And if we think about, okay, older generation of investigators and judges, yes, they can still perform tasks that they've been learning from here. But if we think about young generation of legal officers at the ICC that are just joined an institution and they start using these tools without having first built their own knowledge on how to do investigation, how to do the mapping of cases, how to do these things, I think this is very dangerous.
What about you, Benjamin? Do you want to add in?
Just there, I think Marta's point about de-skilling is like one of the most important things, I think, going forwards. I'll just quickly respond to what I've been reading in this context. In terms of AI, and maybe it's come across in my responses to some of your questions, a lot of the literature I engage with is the kind of more critical literature on AI, both in the context of international justice, but also outside, and then thinking about some of those arguments that's made more broadly around ethics and AI and seeing how they might apply to what we are talking about, international criminal law and justice. So there's one book I've read recently and would recommend to anyone who's interested in AI in this context or outside is a book by Shannon Vallar, who's a ethics and AI philosopher based at University of Edinburgh, and her book, The AI Mirror. I don't know if any of you have read it or not, but it's AI Mirror, How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. And she talks a lot about choices when it comes to how governments and institutions are using AI kind of at the design stage and how AI is designed. And that's about choices for it to act and be certain ways, and there's other choices that could be made. So in terms of thinking perhaps critically about some of these conversations we're having today, that's a book I've read and I would recommend.
Which is another way of saying let's be concerned about bias. And I think we have spoken about it, but not so explicitly during the podcast, but a lot can be reconducted to the bias problem. So what, Benjamin, you discussed at the beginning about the bunch of investigators and people involved in investigation, we have also to think about how all this preliminary material that has been documented, collected by NGOs, then is also used as training data for these systems, and how this then the bias can be essentially fed into the systems and be replicated over the course of the proceedings.
Well, just to end it by saying thank you so much, and sorry for having to cut off the conversation. I mean, there's so many aspects to this, but really, Marta and Benjamin, thank you so much for coming on and giving up your time and explaining some of the issues to us.
Thank you both very much.
It was a pleasure.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.